Justice Tech Pros podcast with Dominic Crea, one of the most unique podcasts on the internet, discussing the obstacles the defense team faces when trying a case, what goes on behind the scenes during pretrial and motion phase, holding defense attorneys accountable, making sure they're fighting for their clients, the difference between textbook law and how things truly play out in a courtroom, and everything in between. Find us on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram at Justice Tech Pros.
Welcome back to A View from Mulberry Street. I am Matthew J. Mary, and I am your host. Today we're going to talk a little bit about history, and, I just want to make the point to all of you that in order to discuss this stuff, we have to use terminology that's been created by the government. And I'm sure that many of you might remember episode 6, The Name Game. That's one of the best episodes and one of the most educational episodes, which outlines how the government gave names to all these groups of people who kind of hang out with each other or clannish, as Joe Bonanno said in his book. They were clans, so they call them the crime families, and they give them names, and the names change. Like, when Joe Profaci is dead and Joe Columbo is the target, the Profaci family becomes the Columbo family, and on and on and on and on. So it's always important not to lose track of that and to understand that, if you're trying to cure cancer, you can't attack it if you can't say the word. So a lot of this history, a lot of this so-called mob history that we're going to talk about today, I've got to use some of these names like, the Bonanno family, the Profaci family, but I'm not inventing that, and I'm not condoning that. And if you look at episode 6, you'll see what Matthew Mary has to say about these names and the name game and the reason for the name game. The reason for the name game is to put people in prison more easily by using this RICO law and giving names to these so-called enterprises. So let's never lose track. We want to have fun once in a while and go down memory lane, but let's not lose track of what this program is about. It's about exposing the government for the things that they do. But anyhow, today we're going to talk, the title of this episode is They Died with Their Boots Off, as compared to the famous movie They Died with Their Boots On. And what I mean by that is that many, many of the people who've been accused by the government of being at the top of the heap of these so-called families, the bosses of the families. Well, anyhow, the government has done a good job identifying a lot of people. And it just kind of tweaked my attention over the years that most of these people that the government have been after have either died in jail. You know about that. My early episodes are all about people dying in jail. And so many of these people that the government identifies, and the historians, the mob history books, yes, they identify certain people to be what they call bosses. And strangely enough, when you look at all these people, not many of them died with their boots off, meaning that they're at the top of the heap, number one, not in jail, and not splattered all over the street or in some secret grave somewhere. Anyhow, I guess you got to start somewhere. No better place than to start with Joe Bonanno. Joe Bonanno is one of my favorite characters, and in many ways was a big part of my life. And I got to meet him a couple of times, once when I was a kid and once when I was a lawyer at age 35 in the commission case. And I was just looking over Joe Bonanno's appearance on 60 Minutes. many, many years ago, where he talked about the book that he wrote and where he tried to describe these so-called families in a much kinder way than the government portrays them. But anyhow, you might say that Joe Bonanno was one of the lucky ones in that in 1965 he retired. Maybe not voluntarily, and went to Tucson, Arizona, a place where I've been. Pretty nice place to live. And Joe Bonanno had a beautiful home there. And he lived, unlike some of his so-called successors, Joe Bonanno lived to the ripe old age of 99, okay? But we can't consider Joe one of our lucky ones because Joe wasn't at the top of the heap, and he kind of got chased out of New York, okay? So, he didn't kind of die with his boots off in splendor, but at least he didn't die in jail. They did put him in jail in his 80s because he wouldn't testify in the commission case. I tell you, only Rudy Giuliani could think of stuff like that. Now, after Joe Bonanno, we're going according to what the government has stamped the Bonanno family. After that, there's a guy named Gaspar Di Gregorio, who I met when I was a little kid. Very nice man. And when bullets started flying all over the place, Gaspar Di Gregorio retired. So he didn't get killed, and he didn't die in jail, but he wasn't around long enough to classify him as one of the lucky ones. Another guy that the government identifies as a so-called boss is a fellow named Paul Sciaca, who is a distant relative of mine. Okay, Paul's a very nice man, and he did not die at the top of the heap. He also was retired. Okay, and this was a guy that the government framed. They framed this man, Paul Sciaca. He was an old man from Italy. And the government put him in a narcotics case when this guy was very close to being a legitimate guy. I'm not saying he was a legitimate guy, but he owned a bank and he owned a coat factory that sold military coats to the government for World War II and the Korean War. I mean, the government declared this guy to be the boss of the family. Next thing you know, they're framing him and putting him in jail. Next thing you know, he's not feeling too well, and he's retired. Going down the list, the so-called Bonanno family. You get Phil Rastelli, who was like an uncle to me, and Phil was a really nice man. He went into jail. Doing 1,000 push-ups every day and 1,000 sit-ups. He used to call me on the telephone. Hey, Matt, I'm doing great. I'm feeling wonderful. All of a sudden, he's got cancer. All these guys, they're doing 1,000 push-ups, 1,000 sit-ups, and all of a sudden they've got cancer. I don't want to tell you what they treated Phil Rastelli with, but all I know is he didn't die in jail because his lawyer at that time, Stanley Teitler, was able to get a court order to have him released as a humanitarian gesture about a week before he died. Okay, this is how nice the government is. They allow the family at their own expense to fly in a medevac helicopter to pick up Mr. Phil Rusty Rastelli, take him out, and bring him to the hospital. And like he died about a week later. I mean, I remember going to see him in the hospital, and he couldn't talk. He looked at me, he held my hand, and just kind of nodded out. So, the government's not too kind when it comes to compassionate release. Not now, and not way back in 1991 when Phil Rusty Rastelli didn't die in jail exactly, but just about. Another fellow that we've talked a lot about on this podcast, also associated with the government calls Bonanno family, is Carmine Galante, Lilo, another guy who's like an uncle to me. And there was a lot of question about, whether he was the boss or the acting boss or trying to be the boss. Well, any which way you want to look at it, Carmine, after doing maybe 30 years of his life in jail, he comes out and winds up getting splattered all over the street. I mean, if you want to see some bloody messes, then you got to tune in to our episodes 24 and episode 25 called Famous Mob Hits. One of the most popular episodes are those two, 24 and 25. You see a lot of gruesome pictures in those episodes. And then later on, after Rastelli dies, the government said Joe Massino becomes the boss of the family, the so-called Bonanno family, and they were out to get Joe Massino for at least a solid decade, spending millions and millions and millions of dollars trying to put Joe Massino in jail. I was his lawyer for many years, and we've talked all about that on previous episodes. But eventually, Joe Massino becomes a cooperator. Oh. So, anyhow, who's next on the list? In the so-called Bonanno family, a fellow named Vincent Mangano, my dear friend, and I and Anthony DiPietro are trying to this day, at this moment, to try to get some relief for Vinny Gorgeous Mangano, to try to get him out of jail. So, I guess the story is, when you look at so-called Bonanno family and all the people that the government, not Matthew Mary, that the government has designated to be the so-called boss, they all didn't make out very well. I mean, none of them had a happy ending, dying with their boots off at the top of the heap, out of jail. Now let's go to what they called, the government first called, and Joe Velacci almost called, the Profaci family. Joe Profaci and Carlo Gambino and Tommy Lucchese are the three subjects that we're going to speak about at the end of this show. They are the guys that the government said were the bosses of their so-called families, and they did not die in jail, and they did die on the top of the heap, and they were not killed. They died with their boots off. So today's episode is about those three. But let's continue on and get past a few of these people. The government says that after Profaci passed away, that his brother-in-law, Joe Magliaccio, took over for a very brief time. And plenty of stories about him. But he died a sudden and strange death after being summoned to some kind of meeting. A meeting, you know about meetings, don't you? When you go to a meeting, you better be prepared to say goodbye to this world. But Joe Bonanno wouldn't go to a meeting, and he lived to 99. Anyhow, Magliaccio did go to a meeting, and he did survive, and it seemed that he was accused of being involved with Joe Bonanno in some kind of plot against the other bosses. This was all written in books, okay? And Joe Magliaccio, he suddenly dies. A lot of people think that he took the pill. If you don't know what that means, they say that in the underworld, on the street sometimes, that the easy solution for someone when they've got big problems is to take the pill. Take a little glass of water, and it's all over, okay? And everything's cool, Everything's cool with everybody when you take the pill. Some people have taken the pill. Who's next? Joe Columbo. Joe Columbo was so famous, and the government was after Joe Columbo so badly that the government changed the name that they had given to the Profaci family. They changed the name to the Columbo family. You know why? Because they were out to slaughter Joe Columbo, and they were out to destroy his whole family. They put all his kids in jail. Listen, they didn't want to stop. But poor Joe, he didn't die in jail, but he got shot in the head at a rally for the Italian-American Civil Rights League, and he survived quite a few years as a vegetable and then passed away. And then my dear friend, my, surrogate father, Carmine Persico, I love that man, and he spent, I don't know how many years in jail. And his last time in jail, I think he did something like 35 years straight. Right before that, he had done 14 years. And, you've heard the story. All of our early episodes on this podcast have been about Carmine Persico, one way or the other. And we fought, Anthony DiPietro and I fought so hard to try to get him out. He was so much worthy of being released on so many levels, and yet they let him die in jail. All right? So not too good a situation, because when the government declares that you're the boss, they're out to get you, no matter what. Okay, so now let's move over to the so-called Gambino family. That's a really interesting name. The Name Game, episode 6, talks a lot about that. They call it, the government calls it, the Gambino family, because that was convenient for them. There are actually like 2 or 3 people before Gambino that the mob historians identify as predecessors. And, it starts off with a guy named Vincent Mangano, who was around from 1931 until 1951. And Vincent Mangano didn't die with his boots off. He got murdered, and it was not a pleasant situation for him. And the government and the mob historians, they say his successor was Albert Anastasia, Albert of Murder Incorporated. And they said that Albert was so bad that everyone was afraid of Albert. Everyone was shaking and quaking in their boots at the mere mention of Albert's name. And what do you know? Albert doesn't die with his boots off. He dies in a barber shop chair. And there's so many photographs of that. Like it's endless. Again, look at Famous Mob Hits, episodes 24 and 25. So who comes next? The second person that we're going to talk about today, Carlo Gambino. Okay, Carlo Gambino, the government says they called him the boss. He was the boss, they said, from 1957 until he died peacefully at his home with his boots on, 1976. Very successful man. We're going to get to him. That's what this podcast is about. Paul Castellano, who was Carlo Gambino's cousin and Carlo Gambino's brother-in-law, the government defined him to be the boss, and they said he was in charge from 1976 until 1985, December 16, 1985, when he and his friend Tommy Bloody was splattered all over the streets, okay? And the government, who had been trying to put Paul in jail for decades, okay? And he was a defendant on the commission case. He was set to get 100 years. But when he got killed, the government they were heartbroken. They were determined to find the killers. Oh, like they really cared about Paul. They didn't give a heck about Paul and whether he lived or died. They were trying to put him in jail for life. But they saw it as an opportunity. When Paul was murdered, they went after John Gotti. And boy, John was their favorite. They went after John 4 times. He beat 3 cases. On the 4th case, they beat him, and they put him in jail for murdering Paul Castellano, the guy that they were trying to put in jail for decades. Now they put John in jail for life, and he died in jail. You remember our episodes about John when the government was so nice when he had cancer of the jaw. They gave John aspirin. Yeah, aspirin, the favorite medication of the Bureau of Prisons. Aspirin. Okay. Who came after John, according to the government and to the mob historians? Peter Gotti. Okay, Peter Gotti was one of the nicest guys that you could ever meet anywhere. And I met him on the street, and I had numerous conversations with him when he was in jail at the MDC. Peter Gotti was the person that the government accused of being the boss after John Gotti, of the Gambino family. Okay, what did they do to Peter Gotti? They held him without bail, first of all right, on the pretense that he's the boss. You know, there are laws like that. Hard to believe. But if the government says that you're the boss of one of these families, okay, no matter what they could prove you did or what they can't prove you did, you get remanded. No bail for you. You just stay there. And also what they did to Peter Gotti while he was in jail, they said that they wanted him isolated in solitary confinement, which made it almost impossible for him to confer with his lawyer. It was a big legal battle, but the government basically won. And they got not only to keep Peter Gotti in jail while he was awaiting trial, but to keep him in solitary confinement so that he couldn't adequately prepare his defense with his lawyer. All right? And then after Peter was convicted and spent, I don't know how many years in jail, at least 10, I think, he was very, very sick. Very, very sick. He had every disease known to mankind, and a motion for compassionate release was put forward on his behalf. And you know what the government says? Oh, no. No compassionate release for Peter. Peter's going to have to die in jail. And so he did. We're going to talk about Tommy Lucchese again. He was, along with Carlo Gambino and Joe Profaci, the only three guys that I think were marked by the government to be bosses of the family, who actually died with their boots off. Not in jail, not murdered, but happily dying in their homes or hospital. So we're going to skip over Tommy Lucchese, talk about the other guys in the family, like Carmine Tramunti. Carmine Tramunti was known as Gribbs or Mr. Gribbs, a well-liked man from Harlem, from Italian Harlem. And he was framed by the government. You'll love this story. A government informant is meeting with an FBI agent. It's something like this. And the informant says that Carmine Tramunti is in on the narcotics deal. And Carmine Tramunti says to this guy, hi, how you like this? Go like this. Hi, okay? The government said that because Carmine Tramunti went like this, hi, that he was giving a signal. That he was giving the signal to say that he was approving a narcotics deal. And listen, you think that's a joke? It wasn't for Carmine Tramunti, because he died in jail. And you know why he died in jail? Because the government said he was the boss of what they call Lucchese family. Next guy, Tony Ducks Corallo, all right? He's one of the defendants on the commission case, and let's just wrap that up by saying he got 100 years, along with so many others, Carmine Persico and Fat Tony Salerno. Tony Ducks Corallo died in jail after receiving 100 years. For doing what? For being part of a bid rigging scheme where a normal person would just get 10 years. You want to give him an extra 5 because you think he's part of organized crime? Go ahead. But no, that's not enough for the government. 100 years. Okay. The next guy they accused of being the boss of the so-called Lucchese family is my client and my personal friend, someone I love, okay, Vic Amusio. And I can't talk too much about Vic Amusio because Anthony DiPietro and I are trying right now to get him out of jail, all right? He's in his late 80s, all right? He's on 30 years, okay? He was framed by his friend, his pal, his best friend, Anthony Gaspipe Casso, Casso. The government flipped Anthony Gaspipe Casso against Vic Amusio, and Gaspipe blamed Vic for every goddamn murder he committed. And then later, you can't make up this stuff. Later, the government doesn't use Mr. Gaspipe, Anthony Casso, because he contradicted another mob rat, Al Diarco. the so-called acting boss, all right? Al Diaco was the most prolific rat in the history of the federal courthouse. And the gas pipe Queso contradicted him with many, many things. And so they used gas pipe to testify against Vicamuso. But they never used him again. They screwed him. They told him, look, you got to go along with what Al Diaco says. And gas pipe said, no, I'm not going along with that. He's kind of a crackpot, you know. And so these are the sad, sad stories of that group. Then there's the group that the government calls the Genovese family. The Genovese family. Vito Genovese. We're going to get to him in a second. But before him, the government says there was a guy named Giuseppe Morello. He was killed, all right? Then there was Joe Masseria. He was killed. And then there was Lucky Luciano, they say. And Lucky Luciano had to die in spite of helping the United States of America, in spite of helping the United States of America win World War II. Charles Lucky Luciano did. Okay? They forced him into exile in Italy, and he had to die all alone back in sunny Italy. And believe it or not, I understand that he did not like that very much. Okay? You have other guys that the government called the boss. They said Frank Costello was the boss, and he got shot in the head, and he decided to retire. Okay. The next guy the government calls the boss is Vito Genevese. Very interesting how they gave this so-called group, this family, they gave it the name, the Genovese family. Vito Genovese, according to them, not according to me, I'm not saying any of this, they say Vito Genovese became the so-called boss, all right, of the Lucky Luciano family in 1957. Vito was in jail in 1959. And you know what? All right? I believe this because I know a little bit about Vito Genovese's case. Vito Genovese was framed by federal informants. Framed, okay? Vito Genovese was a guy who was against drugs. They framed him in a narcotics case. They gave him 15 years in 1959. And Vito Genovese languished in prison until February 14, 1969, when he died of cancer. And I know on good information that they took his body from Atlanta prison, dead, and sent the body to the hospital. And then they declared that he was dead at the hospital. That's another guy, Vito Genovese. He was treated with aspirins for cancer. Another guy that the government was just infatuated with. They were infatuated with Vincent Gigante, also known publicly as Chin. Okay? They couldn't stop going after him in spite of the fact that a league of doctors said this guy was sick in many ways. Not only did his doctors say he was sick in the head, he had a legitimate heart condition that no one could question, okay? But they relentlessly went after him and went after him and went after him until they got him to plead guilty by putting a squeeze on him, arresting family members, everything. Everything goes when you're after Mr. Big, right? That's the way the government operates. They give you the name, they name the family after you, they talk to the jury about the enterprise, the Cosa Nostra. Oh my God, not much about evidence, but after a jury hears for weeks and weeks and weeks and weeks all the stuff about these families and the names of the families, and you could bet you don't have a chance to win in court even before they even hear one stitch of evidence about a crime. So now let's wrap up by talking about the three guys, maybe there were more, who kind of died with their boots on. And you got to give them a lot of credit. One of them is Joseph Profaci. He was born in 1887 in Sicily, and he did 1 year in Sicily in 1920. Did 1 year in prison. Profaci's, people say, why did Profaci be a guy who escaped. Well, first of all, they didn't have Rico in his time. He died in 1962. And Joe Profaci had a lot of friends in the underworld. So even though that he was involved in the so-called wars with the gallows and all that stuff, Profaci's niece, Rosalie, was married to Salvatore, Bill Bonanno, Joe Bonanno's son. They got married right here in my church, down the block, St. Bernadette's. And Joe Profaci, in addition to maybe having some street enterprises, all right, I'll concede that, it's possible. But he was a legitimate guy. I'm not a legitimate guy, but I mean, he had legitimate businesses. He was a legitimate multimillionaire. He was in the olive oil importation business and 20 other businesses that were listed under his name. He was a devout Catholic and a church leader here in Brooklyn, in every kind of organization that you could think of. His grandchildren, all totally legitimate people who know nothing about any of this crap, all right? They went to Xavier High School, as I did, and they're in the olive oil business till today. Yeah, Xavier's a great place. It produced me and my partner on this podcast, Neil Healy. So Joe Profaci knew, where to send his grandchildren. And he died in 1962, and he didn't get killed, and he had a lot of money, and he wasn't in jail, in spite of the fact that the government would have liked to put him in jail, but it was impossible. The next guy, Carlo Gambino. All right, Carlo Gambino, again, was born in Italy in 1902. He died of a heart attack in 1976 at the age of 74. He spent 22 months in prison for tax evasion in the United States. He led a simple life in Brooklyn on Ocean Parkway. I passed his house many a time. I didn't know Carlo, but I know many people who knew him well, very well. And he had one house in Ocean Parkway in Brooklyn and a summer house in Massapequa, Long Island. And he also married his cousin, the sister of Paul Castellano. They had 4 kids, including Tommy Gambino and Joe Gambino, a very well-known philanthropists. I mean, these people were wealthy businessmen. I'm talking about Carlo's sons. Tommy Gambino and Joe Gambino were not only substantial businessmen, but they built hospitals in New York City. They were great charitable donors. And no one gives people like that credit when credit is due. Carlo Gambino's son married Tommy Lucchese's daughter. Thomas married Frances. And so I think that Carlo had a lot of friends, in the underworld who loved him, and he had good relationships. Why did he stay out of jail? Because he made millions in the trucking business in Manhattan's Garment Center. Okay, Tommy Lucchese, same thing. Tommy Lucchese was down in the Garment Center, and at Kennedy Airport, which then was called Idlewild. So there's an example. Carlo Gambino, the guy who comes from Italy, right, and he spends his whole life involved in legitimate business, all right, and he died with his boots off, all right, not in jail and not splattered across the streets of our city. The third guy I'd like to talk about is Gaetano, Tommy Lucchese, also known as Tommy Brown. He was born in 1899 in Italy, and he died here in New York in 1967, again, before the RICO law, okay? And once when he was arrested here in New York, because he had an accident at a factory when he was a young boy working, he lost 2 of his fingers, and so he only had 3 fingers on one of his hands. And there was a baseball pitcher by the name of Mordecai Brown, who also had 3 fingers, and he was the pitcher. The baseball pitcher was nicknamed 3-Finger Brown, and so the cops nicknamed Tommy Lucchese, they nicknamed him Three Finger Brown also. He moved to East Harlem, New York, from Italy. Then he moved to Malba, Queens, quite a nice neighborhood. And then he moved to Lido Beach, Long Island, right next to Long Beach. That's a very exclusive area. I think that's where he died. In 1921, Tommy Lucchese started serving a 13-month sentence at Sing Sing Prison, Ossining, New York, the famous Sing Sing prison. He did 13 months, and that was it. He lived a long time. He controlled many businesses in the Garment Center in Manhattan. He was active in the trucking business and in labor unions. He was close to the politicians of his time, including Mayor Bill O'Dwyer and Mayor Vincent Impellitteri. When Tommy Lucchese died, there were thousands and thousands of people there, including the top politicians in the city of New York. Okay, he was close to other people accused of being gangsters, like Vito Genevese, and as I said before, his daughter was married to Tommy Gambino, Carlo's son. He was close. Tommy Lucchese was close to Santo Trafficante Sr. and Santo Trafficante Jr. of Tampa, Florida. And he also ran businesses at Idlewild Airport, which later became JFK. And he died of a brain tumor at his home in Lido Beach, next to Long Beach in Long Island, in Nassau County. And at the time of his death, he had not spent a day in jail in 44 years. So when we go through the list of all the people that the government has accused of being the so-called boss of the family, okay, of all those people, you would think that there would be more than 3 guys who died outside of prison with their boots off and not murdered or dying in some prison cell alone next to a bottle of aspirins. But those 3 guys were Joe Profaci and Tommy Lucchese and Carlo Gambino. And so that's the view from Mulberry Street today.